one of the things I think which has allowed for Israel to be a successful innovator technologically in other areas is our ability to be spontaneous and to make lemonade out of lemons. And when schedules change and circumstances change, we just delighted to innovate and land on our feet. So my talk is not the opening talk, and some of the things that I spoke about have been said, which is terrific. I can run through those things and maybe go into greater depth. But I'm very, very delighted to be here. Okay, sure enough. So I want to start, first of all, by a moment of philosophical reflection about what today's conference is really about. Because when you think about it, when we talk about the environment, can you hear me there in the back? Got to increase my volume here. I'll go over here. When you think about it, when you look at the sort of great debates of the environment over the years, there is two large camps which have emerged. The first one are the neo-Malthusians, people who see the world as fundamentally constrained, who believe that we are on spaceship Earth and that we have to deal with this planet with great respect and to be extremely modest in the demands that we make on it, and realize that many, many resources are non-renewable, and even renewable resources can be exhausted and polluted and destroyed. And so for them, the issue of water is one where we have to take extreme caution, we have to conserve, we have to do better. I want to say that, and maybe in a moment of disclosure, that I feel myself very strongly in this neo-Malthusian camp. In fact, I'm working now, almost finishing a new book about overpopulation in Israel, and this whole issue, which is clearly Malthus's issue. But the question is this perspective true with regards to water? Because there's a whole nother view, which I would say is the sort of the Promethean or the cornucopian camp, which says, you know, we should not see water as finite. Water is a resource which we can produce. The sky is the limit, and we need to go ahead and run forward and with assumptions that the future will be better and will be more prosperous and more abundant in terms of water. So those are sort of the two different camps, and the question which I think we want to think about today is which paradigm is more appropriate today given innovations, and whether or not there's a middle ground, and what are the perhaps unintended consequences which we would have when we move to some of these new technologies. Because one of the things about Israel environmentally is that to some extent I see ourselves as a back to the future, fast forward vision of how the world is going to be. Because if you saw a slide there that says that 80% of sewage is being recycled in Israel today, and only, was it 12% in Spain or something? Those numbers will change. And Spain very soon will be 30%. Arizona's already up there, and South Florida's at 20%. South Australia's at 20% today. So already one can learn from the mistakes, and hopefully the humility and the ability to learn from our mistakes that Israel can be as a laboratory for some of these technologies. So that's one of the first two debates. The other debate is this one, which I think will focus more in the afternoon, but there is an interface with the technology, and it is this. This is a picture of Boutros Ghali, who was for several years the UN Secretary General, and he was very fond of apocalyptic visions about the next wars of the century will be about water. This is something you heard from various and sundry senior officials in the World Bank, professors if you like, but I'm somebody who maybe in this issue profoundly optimistic. Don't buy it. Don't buy it at all. And I hope that by the time we're done we'll realize that the kinds of, at least in the Israeli neighborhood and the Palestinian neighborhood, the kinds of resource disparities that exist are too small to go to war over when you look at the costs that they're involved. But just to give us a context of this, this is a picture of my friend, I think a colleague of many of ours, Aaron Wolf from the University of Oregon State University, who has done the research. This was his original doctoral stuff where he made an unbelievable database of all the transboundary watersheds in the world. And then he started looking at all the historic conflicts in the world that people thought about water. And he looked about to what extent water has been a source of war. And he says they don't create full-scale wars. In fact, in all of recorded history, only one full-scale war took place, and that was about 4,500 years ago. So I want to start by putting that issue aside. There's a lot of reasons that I think are important geopolitically to move forward with certain water technologies, but nonetheless, I'm not one who thinks that if we don't do that, we're going to go to war. It really hasn't been that way in the past. Of course, we haven't faced the population pressures, but I wanted to start with that. So how much water do we need when we think about this? Mary Falkenmark, almost arbitrarily, about 30 years ago, threw out these two numbers about what makes a water scarce nation versus a water stressed where we can expect that countries that have less than 1,000 cubic meters per person are really in the worst condition. And if you look at the region of the Middle East, really 9 of 14 of them have that kind of level of scarcity. How much water are we going to have to produce? Sandra Postel, who used to work for many years here at World Watch Institute, has talked about the need for the equivalent of 20 Nile rivers to be added as the world's population marches forward from 7 billion to 8 billion and 9 billion. Certainly our region, again, is a microcosm. You can look at the numbers of Israel, 1950 million people, 2 million people in 1960, 3 million, up to 8 million people today. Even if Israel stopped its present pronatal policies and we moved to 2 kids per family, there will still be 15 million people in Israel 25, 30 years from now. I'm delighted to live in a country with such tremendous life expectancy, but that is the implication. And it's not just our neighborhood. Jordan started with about 500,000 people in 1950. The second largest city in Jordan, I'm told, is the new refugee camp, about 1 million people coming over from Syria. They took 1 million refugees in from the Iraqi war. Their population is growing also unbelievably fast. Palestinian population as well. We know about the fertility rates there, which have come down but are still high. Egypt, Syria. There's a lot more people, and the water, the natural water resources, are not getting any better. And this gives you a sense, if you look at anybody with a number over 100, that's already the kind of deficit which is built in, where people are using more water because of these population pressures. So my first point would be, no matter what we think about water, standing still is not an option because we're already in overdraft. And so we're not going to send those people out of the region. They're going to want to drink water and need it every day. And Jordan perhaps offers a good example. Here you can see that unbelievable gap, already over 50%, and every year it's going to be 2% more because there's no new water coming in to Jordan if they hadn't just signed a deal on desalination, which we can talk about. So let's take a look at Israel's experience and what we can learn from it. Israel having this somewhat idiosyncratic hydrological situation with this very, very steep rain gradient from 50 or hyper, or even 10 or 20 if you go further south, millimeters up through the north of the country. And of course, as it's drier in the south, it also has faster evaporation. So Israel has really only about 7% of the land which is not characterized as dry lands. So it is prototypic of the area. And because we've sort of talked about this briefly, I'll race through. The original historic response to this was what I call hydro-socialism, which was an era of time when Israel was a very, very socialist kind of country in the 1950s and 60s. We took from the rich and gave to the poor, and we did that in water as well. The Galilee, like I said, gets a lot of water in the, you can see up there, as much as 800 millimeters of rain per year, and they would bring that down to the desiccated Southlands and create this national network where everybody could buy water for the same price, and you can see still the open canals of the water carrier today, allowing us to produce this unbelievable agricultural turnaround, where areas really that had from time immemorial been considered desert areas, basically for those of you familiar with Israeli geography, from Gadara to the south, which have now turned large areas of it into bread baskets and highly fertile zones. And that was because of this unbelievable commitment at the time of Israel's leaders to invest at the time 60% of the infrastructure budget into a national water carrier. But of course, there were unintended consequences, and there are many of them, one of which is that the salinity that this brought down, because the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, that provided the water to the national water system, is as a highly saline lake. It's not the Dead Sea, but it's much saltier than the natural groundwater is. And then, of course, when you take out 1 billion cubic meters a year, which used to flow through the Jordan River, you get the present dynamics of the Dead Sea. I'm sure Clive, my good friend and colleague here, who's much bigger expert than I am on the Dead Sea, will talk about what that means in terms of the terrible infrastructure problems we have in the sinkholes, and what it means when you fundamentally change the hydrological balance, as Israel has done over the last 65 years. The second stage was this notion of wastewater reuse. Again, for many years, we all felt very, very proud that Israel had made this very bold statement that we closed the circle, and what was once a hazard is now a resource. And indeed, Israel has moved very dramatically from 1956, when there was basically no sewage, and we put in our first major sewage plant, the Shafdan, which he showed you earlier, and now we're moving forward into secondary and tertiary treatment, and you can see the increasing numbers of plants that provide the advanced treatment that we want, which is critical because we are now seeing wastewater as the next step in expanding our water resources once we've pretty much taken everything we could from the Galilee. The thing is, once again, there will be unintended consequences. Here's one which turns out to be a very surmountable one, and that's the issue of boron. Boron is a element that's very basic. Everybody needs a little bit of boron, but if you take too much in the basic equations of toxicology, it becomes toxic. And so all of a sudden, farmers who were using wastewater found that their leaves were starting to wilt because they were getting too high a dosage of boron. Why are they getting boron? People started looking, they said, well, it's wastewater that's being recycled, and what do people do when they finish, say, using their detergents? They flush it down the toilet, or the water in the clothes washer moves onto the central system, and that creates it. So Israel had a fairly simple magic bullet in terms of regulation, where we literally banned boron in detergents, sort of a source reduction commitment, and all of a sudden you can see the numbers on the screen, how very quickly, by 2008, that's the last date if you can't recap the number, we had more or less licked the problem of boron in this issue. Nonetheless, one of the things that this wastewater reuse has done has allowed us now to bring water into the desert areas that had been desertified. You can see this massive loss of soil actually can now be restored. But here's the thing, there may be unintended consequences. Again, first of all, salinization. Before I even go into this slide, I should say that for many years, some of the best thinkers, people like Professor Dan Zaslavsky and the Technion and whatever, have been warning about the euphoria with regard to wastewater reuse, because any kind of a wastewater system is going to be saltier than the natural water we have. You put wastewater into a reservoir, it's hot, water evaporates, salts stay behind, and it will eventually be very salty. And he argued we're going to lose more than we gain if we have a reasonable time horizon in terms of what it costs to restore our soils. The other thing I want to talk about is endocrine destructing chemicals. It's an issue which I've only become involved in about the last 2 years because of a grant we received from the USAID, and this is a wonderful opportunity to open up parentheses and say that this is the year that Congressman Henry Waxman is retiring. I wouldn't say this anywhere but inside the Beltline, but Henry Waxman has been a congressman, if I'm not mistaken, for 40 years. It's an unbelievable record. But he pioneered and initiated a program called the Merck program about 30 years ago, Middle East Research and Cooperation, which encouraged environmental research between Israel and its neighbors and allowed for a lot of the research, which maybe I'll talk about up ahead when we talk about that. And he's retiring. We only can hope that when he's gone, there will be other champions of this wonderful program, which continues. Anyway, so the one I want to talk about was ADCs. This was an issue, that came up big time in the 1990s when this book, Our Stolen Future, became sort of the silent spring, at least they claimed it would be, of the decade, when they started looking at all these horrible things that were happening to fish who were producing bizarre sexual characteristics, reproductive anomalies, and they'd seen it earlier with those eggshells with DDT in birds, but the sense was that there are lots of chemicals which are in very, very minute quantities, parts per billion concentrations, can really wreak havoc on a hormonal system. And the ending chapter was, well, we know what's going on in nature, but what's going to happen when people are exposed to these chemicals? So we have some very interesting research which came out of Hadassah Hospital. One emphasized came out of Hadassah Hospital, not out of Greenpeace or a tree-hugging agency. When Ronit Chaimov-Kochman, who ran the fertility clinic, started looking at the concentration of sperm amongst donors who were coming into a fertility clinic. And she found some shocking numbers, that between 1994 and 2099 versus the subsequent decade, 2004 and 2008, there was a 40% drop in the concentration of the people coming on average into the clinic. And there was associated damage or poor quality of motility. Now, as I said, I'm very concerned about the issue of demography and overpopulation, but this isn't how you want to control it. There's other indications that we have problems with EDCs in our water. The age of puberty amongst girls has gone down 10 months in the last decade. Testicular cancer up 300% amongst Israeli Jews, 1,000% amongst Israeli Arab citizens. And when I heard this lecture from the professor from Tel Aviv, and I said, oh, surely this is an artifact of better diagnosis, because that was something in breast cancer. He said, no, no, no. There's no such thing as a false positive in testicular cancer. When you have it, you know it. So things are happening, and the question is why? What makes Israel different? Because there are, in the rest of the world, comparable phenomena of sperm count drop, but nothing of this magnitude when the experts came over to talk to us. So 23% of donors are rejected, reproductively impaired levels. And my hypothesis, well, what makes Israel so different is we have wastewater reuse. And we've been doing this for 30 years. And you know what? That's about how much time it takes to percolate into the coastal aquifer, into some of our wells. Maybe that's what's going on here. So we're very lucky to be doing research. Here's students, mine and my colleague, Nader El-Khatib, looking. This particular one is the Kidron stream coming off the wastewater of Jerusalem, where we started looking for these chemicals, and lo and behold, we're starting to find estriol, bisphenol A, other kinds of chemicals which are endocrine disruptors. This particular slide shows a green line, which is, yes, indeed, the green line, which distinguishes, and you can see that there is a natural dissipation, but nonetheless, concentrations which should make us nervous. My friend and colleague, Dror Avisar from Tel Aviv University, has found already high concentrations of antibiotics, which is something we all want to be concerned about, in wells where they've been using wastewater recycling for over 20 years. So we know that some of these, certainly the pharmaceuticals are making it there. So this is something we want to think about as we move forward with our wastewater reuse. And of course, Israelis get it in the, already by the mid-1970s, we had about 72% of Israelis preferring to drink bottled water. I drink tap water, but I've always been a risk taker, so that's not that. The last thing, just because the JNF is a co-sponsor of some of these events, I wanted to say a word or two about another stage of the wastewater collection. If you are going to go into this business of wastewater treatment, you've got to have ways to capture, particularly in Mediterranean climates like Israel or California or the Middle East, where you don't have rain during the wintertime. So with an asymmetrical precipitation situation, you want to be able to hold water in the wintertime when farmers don't need it. So in the summertime, when they desperately need it, they can do that. So putting together 207 reservoirs at a high cost really started as a stormwater system or water harvesting, but really became a way of almost another treatment level. But this has been a big addition to the water system. I'm not going to say almost anything about drip irrigation because very soon you will be treated to a presentation by Nati Barak. Are you here, Nati? He's coming. Okay, so he's the best advocate that you could have about this. But when we're talking about all these Israeli innovations in water management, they're all dealing with issues of supply, okay? It's common if you analyze water policies of a country that the first stage is the frontier stage when people are making more water and creating new sources. But sometimes it's a balance, and we want to think about controlling demand. And Israel's been so remarkable in reducing its demand because Israel's farmers are now producing 14 times the yields that they produced, and yet using probably less than the fresh water. And that has a lot to do with this. I was talking about these ancient systems which you can't find anymore in Israel, these sort of sprinkler irrigation systems which have been replaced. And the gentleman on the right is Simcha Blas, who has done it. But because we're having a special presentation, I'm going to leave it and just say this is a relatively new technology. And I'm delighted. I'm spending this last 6 months in Stanford, California. I went up to Humboldt County, and I was really felt so proud to be an Israeli to meet all the marijuana farmers up there who praised the unbelievable addition and additional value which they've gotten because of our benefits. So you know, it stops disease. With the wastewater use, you can do it on in steep areas, and it has you can reach the root zones directly. Can add precise levels of fertilization. It slices, it dices. It's great stuff. So that's one way to save water. But even so, Israel is facing new hydrological constraints. This is a map, a graph of what was going on in the Kinneret, our national reservoir, between the years 2004 and 2009, where we reached historic lows because of successive years of drought. This year looks to be maybe the biggest year of drought of all. In the last month of January, there was 0 rain. In February, practically none. And so at that point in 2009, Israel decided we've got to get the public involved. It's not enough just for farmers to save money. The municipal sector has to be involved. And the water commissioner at the time decided to come out with very tough regulations about watering lawns and washing cars. And the mayors put up a hue and cry, and he ended up having to pull it aside. And instead he said, I'm just going to appeal to the public and ask them to do the right thing and save water. And he did that, and people started to listen, but it wasn't enough. So then Israel did what it does best. It innovated. So what was the great Israeli innovation which led to this remarkable thing? If you look at this graph, you can see the demand for water, which took place during the months of 2009. And I want to point out that the purple graph is what was in 2009, far below the levels of demand amongst the municipal sector in 2006, 7, and 8. So the question is, how did this happen? Especially for water, because all economic theories of water will tell you that it's an inelastic resource. If you raise price, people will not reduce water. And as a father of 3 daughters, having watched them go through adolescence, I can yell up, shorten that shower! The Kinneret is going empty, and they will continue to shower and say, yeah. So how did Israel do it? Well, we did it because we realized that not only women shower, but also men. And so this particular, this is by the way a monthly thing, but some of you may be familiar with one of Israel's great resources, Bar Rafaeli. This is a cover of the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition. And Bar Rafaeli has gained acclaim maybe in the sports world for her work in the Sports Illustrated, but in the water world, we appreciate the fact that she agreed to be the cover girl or the poster girl for our campaign in 2009. So when she said, we're running out of water, every Israeli male between the ages of 15 and 35 said, I won't shower for a month. No problem. If Bar's asking, so that was really, I think, and it's a good thing, too, because if you look, remember, he said there was 1170 was the amount of water, but that's a number. The number we've had for many years was 1,500. In other words, the gloomy projections of climate change are not just Al Gore's obsession. They're our new reality in Israel. And you can see these changes where the water resources have come down that much, and really we're seeing dramatic changes where 2011 was the driest year, and we're looking at what might be the worst year. So we really have to do these things better. So with Israeli streams disappearing and with agriculture getting cut every year further and further, and even orchards having to be dried up, the government decided to act. And when the government decided to act, the big step forward, was about a decade ago, was to say we are going to embark on this bold new venture of desalination, and we heard a word or two about it from Asaf's wonderful talk. It, of course, was an idea whose time had finally come. Ben-Gurion, like everything else, was about 50 or 60 years ahead of us on this, and I'll read a few lines of this. The purification of seawater by an inexpensive process is not only valid for Israel, it is a necessity for the world. Hundreds of millions of the inhabitants of the great continent in which we live suffer from lack of food, yet only a small part of the earth's surface is tilled. If Israel succeeds in desalting the water of the sea, it will bring great benefits to the entire human race, and the task is not beyond the power of Israeli science, etc., etc. So the irrigation of the desert with purified seawater will appear a dream to many, but less than any other country should Israel be afraid of dreams. So that's in 1956. At that time, membrane technology was not where it needed to be, and the cost of desalination was such that that kind of vision couldn't take place. So this massive move where Israel has increased its water supply by 50% in less than a decade has really taken place for several reasons. You can see here the plan, new master plan. This is going to happen. It's going to be probably another 500 million cubic meters to go on in the next decade. And this end of hydro-socialism, which he mentioned, the fact that water no longer comes from the north, comes from the center of the country, from wastewater, from desal, has really been a huge change. So just a word or two about desalination. We know there's different salinities. You don't only have to desalinize seawater, you can take brackish water. It's even cheaper to do that. Desalination is something which is coming to the world in a very big way. Currently, 21,000 land-based plants are desalinizing water in Israel. And I'm spending there in California. And I know when I come back in 10 years, the coast is going to be filled with desalination plant. This is how it breaks up. Now, Americas are far behind, but they will catch up. For many years, desalination was the province of Arab countries who used flash distillation, high energy technology, but then they had plenty of energy. Since that time, the new way of looking at it with reverse osmosis has taken over. Take a look at the Mediterranean Sea. It's not just Israel. Everybody's doing it, a brand new dance. Here's the Red Sea as well. And like I said, the reverse osmosis has become the technology of choice. I'm delighted that the membranes for the technology were developed, for the original ones, at Ben-Gurion University, because that's my university and co-sponsors of the day. So in the great Israeli tradition of shameless self-promotion, I'll say a word or two about this kind of technology. Anyway, basically you pre-treat the water to get out all the schmutz and all the things that should be there, and then you push it through these membranes, which I guess you can see in the previous slide, excuse me. There are these long membranes, and on one side H2O comes out and brine comes out on the other side, and it's a pretty good deal. And the reason why it's become so popular is the costs have come down so dramatically over the past decade, where it used to cost in a good facility about $1 for a cubic meter, about 1,000 liters, and now it's 54 cents roughly. And I want you to think about that. How much do you pay for that bottled water that you bought at the 7-Eleven at the store for a liter of it? Maybe $1 or $2. So we're talking about 1,000 liters of pure H2O, better water than there, for 54 cents. Okay, and that goes back to my original point. When you think about our whole disagreement with the Palestinians over the mountain aquifer, which is 300 million cubic meters, it used to be before climate change, that's $150 million. You don't go to war over $150 million. I mean, compared to the price of an F-15 fighter jet. So today we do have this ability, and I would like to hope that this makes a difference. And the reason why, here you can take a look at the cost components, but it's this tremendous drop in the energy requirements because the membranes are so much more efficient, and the operation and maintenance has come down dramatically as well. Now there are tremendous environmental benefits to desalination. I want to, before I start talking about the downside, let's recognize this. You increase your water supply, which means you can leave more water in the streams of Israel, which have become more abundant as they dried out year after year. We can do that. Also, anybody who spent any time in Israel and looked at their electric tea kettle knows what scale is like, and the fact that you can now have water which is much softer will, apparently in terms of saving water heaters and the like, is going to save tens of millions of dollars, almost balancing the cost-benefit equation. But it has a downside, and let's talk about this, because with all the optimism that Asaf left us with, there is, that's our job, the environmentalist side, to sort of talk about things that we need to worry about. And I do worry about the planet's climate. So if a new 250 milliliter plant produces the same as 120,000 new cars, give you a sense, Ashkelon, which is our first big new desal plant, creates energy comparable to a city of 55,000 people. Now that's not unbelievably large, but it's not insignificant. And the basic equation that for 1 liter of petrol, you need that's what you need for 1,000 liters of water, means that all of a sudden water and energy, which were always linked, are now inextricably bound when we think about public policy and what we want to do. There's also the issue of coastal impacts and what that means. We have long-term impacts in terms of withdrawing water. It doesn't seem that that seems to have been a problem, but there's the discharge of antiscalants. And antiscalants are what you use in desalination plants when you want to make sure that your membranes don't get clogged up from all the things that you didn't manage to get out. And these chemicals will keep them operating for long periods of time. But afterwards, when you discharge that 40% of the brine into the sea, they are there. And so the question is, what is that happening there? And you can see what happens if you don't use these antiscalants to the membrane. So you do want to use them. So the assumptions were, and this is, I'm quoting a dissertation that was written in 2008, that their toxicity is low and that only very, very immediate impacts are found around discharge areas. But in a place like the Mediterranean Sea, which is so nutrient poor, it turns out that the discharge areas around our desal plant pipelines have actually become little fisheries, because all of a sudden, all of these iron and other things can help them out there. So there's some sense of people relaxed. And then in 2011, this article came out which pointed to a somewhat broader radius of impact in the sea from discharge. Again, 400 meters, I don't think that's a huge amount to worry about, except that we're going to have a whole lot of these facilities along our coastline and in the Mediterranean. So the cumulative impact is something which I think we need to monitor and think about a lot, and I'm not so sure that people are paying attention to this in the macro sense. Anyway, the one thing we've been very successful, I think, about in Israel is planning smartly. This is a picture of the Hadera desalination facility, and in fact, the desal plant is tiny when you look at the overall complex of Israel's electricity. And by taking this new infrastructure demand and putting it into an existing electricity plant, you in fact can get away with putting in a lot of new facilities without giving up some of our limited 200 kilometer beach area. So I think so far Israel's been very clever about placing our facilities, and the fact that you can build rather efficiently, I think, means this is not a problem. So the question is this going to exacerbate or help our problem? So first of all, I want to wrap up the environmental record of the desalination. I think that we have shown in the Israeli experience that siting does not have to be disastrous, and that the marine discharges so far seem to be reasonable in terms of their impact, not going beyond a 400 or 500 meter zone. But the downside is the energy which is lost, and the notion that it perpetuates a supply side mentality. And I want to say a word or two about this before we go forward. One of the hardest things for the Israeli environmental community to accept about this sea change in our perspective of water to desalination is this. For so many years, we've been preaching the gospel of sustainability, which is a narrative of being humility towards the earth and using as few resources as possible and recognizing that ultimately we need to be stewards because there's so little available. And then one day we have to wake up and say, oh, everything that we told you for the last and is no longer true with water because we can make as much as we want. That's a hard shift to make. And many people argue that, in fact, the great fear is that people will stop conserving water and that we won't have Bar Raffaelli on our TV screens anymore. But seriously, there is a concern that. But I would, and I think it is a legitimate concern, but there are compelling reasons which I would argue make desalination a good idea for our region. So one of this has to do with the dynamics between us and the Palestinians. For too long, water has been a hostage in the overall negotiations. But surely now, when we can make water so inexpensively, the debate over the mountain aquifer, which is really the bone of contention, those 300 million cubic meters of water which fall in the West Bank, but which flow naturally into the pre-1967 Israel, now we can kind of get beyond this so-called hydrohysteria and move forward. So I would like to think that by improving our own domestic supply, all of a sudden Israel's ability to be generous, flexible, has gone up quite a bit. Now, Palestinians have had reservations, and I'm sure we'll have talk about this today. They're not as enamored. First of all, much of the water that was offered to them would have been desalinized inside of Israel, not in the Gaza Strip, which means they would feel that they were still dependent on Israeli goodwill, and Israel would actually sit with the faucet, and that's not their idea of national sovereignty and independence. They also think that it's expensive for agriculture, and that desal plants are temporary. They're not like an aquifer. People can blow them up if they're a terrorist. They can fall apart. They can lose. They want to feel that if they have a national right to groundwater, they should be entitled to it. And that's a position which is legitimate. My only argument with it, when I talk about them, is that the amount of water they think they have in the first place in the mountain aquifer is not what it used to be because of climate change. And we're all going to have to get on that new technology with it. I just wanted to say that Israel is not the only country that's made this kind of a shift. Australia has moved forward with a variety of desal facilities. Some people claim that it was a bit of an overreaction to several years of drought, and by now many of them are not being used. But the point I wanted to make was that in Australia, the good citizens of Sydney, by referendum, demanded that any new desal plant would be balanced with a renewable energy facility. So the carbon footprint would be neutral of these plants, okay? And I think that's something which is very important. I would be much happier to pay 65 cents for 1,000 liters of water, but to know that I wasn't exacerbating the kinds of global, the greenhouse gases we have in the atmosphere And I think this is one of the lessons we can learn from there. And what I wanted to say was that at the time, desal was hugely controversial. There were demonstrations, and people didn't want this. No to Bob Carr, he was the Premier of New South Wales. We don't want your desal plant. They thought it was a waste of money. They thought it was a waste of energy. And the Spanish experience, they're the biggest desalinized water users in Europe. They've been doing it for years, starting in the Canary Islands. And they've also moved forward. And there again, it became a highly contentious, here's the pictures from the Canary Island, and it became a highly contentious political issue. The leader of the opposition wanted to go fight it. I don't know if he was such a greenhouse gas advocate beforehand, but when the Prime Minister said, let's go to desal, he fought it. So it was a very contentious political issue. So then my question was, the other thing in Spain, it's been a disaster because none of these plants that they built are being used. They just got built, whatever. But the point is that some people would argue that in the 21st century, desal facilities might become the new dams in terms of the flashpoints and for the new populations. In Israel, that has not happened. And Israel's environmental movement, nobody can claim that they are a timid and well-disciplined group. They're very, I wouldn't say obstreperous, but they're very opinionated, and they're very happy to express their opinions. And yet on this issue, there was a recognition that desalination was ineluctable. And I think part of that has to do with the natural technological optimism that exists in the country. The peace implications were huge. Environmentalists got it. We're not going to be able to work things out with our neighbors easily without desal. The dire situation with streams, it was basically 1 minute before midnight for many of these aquatic ecosystems. And as time went on, we saw that the regulatory presence was working, because all of the concerns about privatizing water, and that's what desal's done, it's created a whole new source of water which is not owned by the public, have not materialized. It is cheap, it's high quality, and the consumer hasn't suffered. So I believe as we look to the future, agriculture is going to be a major position of this. Now I want to wrap up with just one or two more points about these issues. First of all, I want to point out what my friend Yaakov Garb, who's a colleague at Ben-Gurion University, wrote in this book, Water Wisdom, which was mentioned at the outset. And I'm going to read it because I agree with it so much. He said, ironically, in creating a stable source of pure water, not subject to the climatic variations of our region, Israel has buffered itself to one source of vulnerability, but exposed itself to several others. With desalination, Israel is increasingly dependent on water quality in the Mediterranean, the terms of decade-long contracts, and above all, to energy price variability. They may introduce future energy constraints. So, although I see it is inevitable, let's not be too blinded by the success to realize that there may be downsides, and as the price of energy goes up, or maybe as the world finally gets serious about climate change, there's going to be implications. So I don't have time to address some of these issues, but when we think about the conflict between ourselves and the Palestinians, this was taken from an article by Chaim Gewirtzman, who is the far right of the Israeli hydrological world. And he wrote an article where he was criticizing water management in the West Bank. And every single one of these issues, the high levels of leakages, 33%, and the lack of sewage treatment, all these things really do have a technological solution if I think the funding agencies can provide the infrastructure which is necessary. And I'm sure we'll talk about these issues in the afternoon. But he reckons that if they did these things, that the present use of water of 200 million cubic meters could probably go up to 300 million as well. And that's, of course, before the Gaza Strip, which is in desperate need of the desal plant to go online. So the question I want to ask is sort of, first of all, if we move forward and think about the future, are we ready for a water market? The idea now that we can produce water so inexpensively does lead one to think that perhaps we need to stop thinking of water as in terms of national sovereignty, but rather as just another commodity. That's not a popular way of environmental way of looking at it, but sure would be an easier way to diffuse so much of the passion around this issue. We did an interesting study. This is a master's student of mine, Adam Abramson. We looked at the willingness to pay. This is for stream restoration, for wet streams, people letting wastewater go into streams and dry. And this was the fascinating response. The first two, Alexander and Zomar, that's the same stream. The Palestinians call it the Zomar stream, we call it Alexander. But take a look at this, okay? The Zomar the Palestinian side of it, people were willing to pay more, significantly more than the Israeli side, even though the per capita income in Israel is so much higher. And the same is true to a lesser extent when we look at the Beersheba Hebron water stream. But the point is that the willingness to pay in the Palestinian sector for water and clean water is higher than Israel, which suggests, I think, even unusually high commitment to environmental quality. So there's a willingness, and the truth of the matter is, so many of them are forced to buy bottled water anyway. They're already paying the higher prices. Maybe you want to think in terms of that. And so privatization may not be such a 4-letter word or 18-letter word or whatever it is when we think about the future. And indeed, as so many people are buying bottled water anyway, maybe that has changed our way of thinking about water. I just wanted to say my last point. A couple years ago, I was asked to write a draft environmental treaty with Mohammed Saeed Al-Hamedi, who used to be the director of the Ministry of Environment in Ramallah. The idea was to create a possible roadmap for the future. And one of the things we had a big Israeli and Palestinian committee. I think we did a pretty good job, and we can only hope that the negotiators think so as well. But one of the things in there was this notion of peace parks. I just want to end on a positive note. And these are transboundary areas that are protected, that are formally dedicated to protection and maintenance of biological diversity, et cetera. Basically, we're saying, rather than let's fight the zero-sum war over territory, maybe we let nature in on this and trump some of these festering long conflicts by creating natural areas. And so there's examples, I don't think you can read that on the screen, but in Southern Africa, here's an area that was for years in conflict between countries. Now it's in a peace park, and how lucky we are in the world that we can have this place preserved, and the local communities who can benefit from the ecotourism, the same that we can see in areas and others. In Israel, we already have the Naharaim Peace Park, which is an artifact of the peace treaty with Jordan, where this island, which is the confluence of the Yarden and the Jordan and the Yarmouk River, is essentially a place where Jordan has sovereignty, but Israelis can come and visit without passports. Did it just 6 months ago. I brought my parents. They were speechless. They had no idea. It's one of the best kept secrets. And I'm thinking that in water, this might be an issue. So recently, this kind of idea was proposed by Friends of the Earth Middle East, a regional environmental advocacy group. I'm on the board of, so I should say that. Obviously, I think they do good work, but they brought together the mayors of Jordanian towns, Palestinian towns, and Israeli towns. And the basic message is we cannot wait for the decision makers to go forward and start acting to protect our resources. We have to work together. And as a result of this, the first declared eco park of its kind was declared with Jenin and Gaboa, done at the local level, very much a bottoms-up effort. So I do believe that there is a basis for working together. As we look at our two negotiators, and salute John Kerry, who's brought, I think, wonderful energy in this process, and I'm very, very grateful to him. I think that we can believe that the technology can create some of the win-win dynamics that we look for in the region. Let's not minimize the importance of the economic disparities, but realize that there is so much common concern for water resources that it can bring us together and create a single strategy. I think we need to do this in ways that have much more specific and grounded in standards than we did in the past, but that indeed this can be a source of cooperation. So thank you very much for your listening. And
Alon, thanks very much for the inspiring presentation. We'll ask you to stay up here. We have about 12 minutes before lunch. So we'll field a couple of, yes, we do have lunch. We don't have to rush, okay. But we will take a couple of questions. Perhaps we'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time. And we have someone here in the front. Anyone else? Someone there at the back? Please introduce yourselves as well.
Michael Kudzik, work for the Department of Agriculture in the Middle East. We started the whole discussion with Herzl's quote. Can you tell us the condition of the Dead Sea now and what the implications are for the fact that it's now 2 seas or maybe 3 seas? I don't know.
So something on the Dead Sea. We'll take 2 or 3 questions because we have a fairly limited time. And there's Stuart Schoenfeld in the back.
Stuart Schoenfeld from York University. 2 specific questions. Recently, the Knesset had a visitor from West Germany, from Germany, who
You had to bring it up. Not the Knesset's finest moment.
Made an offhand comment about the disparity between water allocation to Israelis and the allocations to Palestinians on the West Bank. And there was a mini uproar in the Knesset and in the press afterwards. Maybe you'd like to comment on that. And on the desalination, the sewage from Gaza is not treated, it goes directly into the Mediterranean. And I read a number of years ago concern about the sewage clogging the intake pipes into the desalination plants. So maybe you can comment on that as well.
Okay. Great, thank you. Is there another question? We have one question, and then we'll turn the microphone back to Alon.
Hi, my name is Mary Bergman with a publication at the IR. I have a question. I've done a lot of research on China. I know Israel has offered a lot of advice. And I just wonder, I realize it's a very large question, but what do you think of the potential of applying what Israel has done to the scale of China, including the incredible depth of pollution of groundwater, surface water? What is the potential? I know they are have built a desalination plant in Tianjin, which has been very effective, but is it possible to do what Israel's done on such a large scale?
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, so the first question was, what about the condition of the Dead Sea? Well, the situation of the Dead Sea is dreadful, and it's something that should concern all of us because I feel like it's on our watch. Clive, are you going to talk about the Dead Sea this afternoon?
I can.
Okay, but you have somebody who does spend much more time than me, but I would just say, from my own perspective, and I guess I did advise the government about the southern part of the Dead Sea, so I know a little bit about it. Look, you cannot take 1 billion cubic meters out of the Jordan River and expect the Dead Sea to stay as it is. Okay, so basically what you have here is the flip side of the great Zionist success story of making the desert bloom, and it requires us all to stop for a moment and think whether we want to continue that particular paradigm or not. I don't know, unlike a lot of my friends who think, okay, let's just close the faucet on the national water carrier, let the water flow over from the Kinneret and go into the Jordan River and restore the natural order of things, and the Dead Sea will repair itself. I'm not sure that that sanguine kind of vision is valid for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's not valid, and the Dead Sea, by the way, people don't know, is disappearing by slightly more than 1 meter every year, okay? And that's the depth, but in fact it retreats many more because it's not an exact 90-degree thing. So when you go there, it is just so discouraging to look at the spa in En-Gedi and the train that literally has to take people to the water to be able to bathe. So we're really creating our own Aral Sea there. So, but I'm not so sure that returning the Jordan flow, because it's clear that the Jordan River basin has much less water, about 20% less, so it's not clear that there will be so many years that the Kinneret will overflow. And I'm not so sure that our friends in Jordan who get water in Amman 1 day a week will see a natural flow going into the Dead Sea of a lot of fresh water and say, oh, because of aesthetics and a sense of commitment to the future generations, we are going to literally, make the citizens of Amman go thirsty. So if we were going to do something like this, it has to be part of a broader agreement. There was, I think, a significant amount of disinformation in the agreement signed at the World Bank, I guess about a month ago now. I wrote an article in the Huffington Post, if anybody, so I won't go into too much depth, but basically it was declared, oh, we've now made the first Red Dead pipeline. We've taken water from the Red Sea and brought it to the Dead Sea. It was the brine from a desalination plant. It's a trivial amount. It's important because it was the first water agreement that we've had in maybe 20 years now, and it did bring a bit of life back to this notion of a regional water scale, but it is not a Dead Sea saving methods. We still have to do that. The conventional or party line for the environmental movement is to be deeply distrustful of dead red conduit proposals because it's these massive technological interventions and nobody knows where it'll end up. I'm a little bit less, it's not that I'm less suspicious, but I don't see a lot of choices and I don't want it to go down on my watch. I would like to, yeah, using the height differential from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea and bringing the water.
Mediterranean to the Dead Sea.
Well, the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea has proven by test after test and cost-benefit analysis after cost-benefit analysis to go up the mountain to Jerusalem and go back down. It doesn't make as much sense as far as that goes. The second question was Stewart's, who asked initially about the Gaza sewage. Well, it doesn't matter. We'll do them both. I won't hide from either, even though I'd rather hide from one of them. with regard to Gaza sewage, that was supposedly a concern, but I guess dilution is sufficient. I've been to Ashkelon, which is the plant nearest, maybe 5 times in the last 5 years with students. I go every year because I just feel like I'm entering a sci-fi movie when I go into a desal plant. And there doesn't seem to be any problem, both even in terms of clogging or with any kind of residuals, bacterial or otherwise. They do a pretty good job there. So although it's something that needs to be monitored, it doesn't seem to have been. I guess the discharge is far enough out and far enough away that it's not going to reach it. With regard to the reception that the Knesset gave to the EU representative about, I think, first of all, when you have guests, you need to be more polite. Israel's got a lot of wonderful characteristics, maybe high levels of courtesy may not be at the top of the list, and this was an unfortunate display of that. But I think the point that he made is true, that regardless of historic reasons or otherwise, it is unconscionable, in my mind, for my friends in Bethlehem and Ramallah to get water once or twice a week, and to, God help the family that doesn't fill up their cistern the day they get it flowing, and then they won't be able to wash their clothes. I think this is not something which, even though it is true that Palestinians get much more water in a day-to-day sense than they're supposed to get under the interim agreement, but the interim agreement was never any kind of a real solution. So there's no question, I would think, I haven't found anybody who really thinks that the levels of per capita water allocations to the Palestinians are sufficient. Those who justify it say, well, as part of an overall agreement, we can increase that. But it's been so long, I think that we have to break that mentality and say on a humanitarian issue, it's time to move forward and give them the water they need and the water that we would like to share as being good neighbors. So that's my own personal view. It does not represent the view of the Israeli government, and maybe one day it will. The final question was with regard to China. Wow. China's a very big place. So there are parts of China where Israeli innovations in the arid region might be valuable. I can say that Ben-Gurion University just signed an agreement to set up a sort of a campus facility. I work at the Institutes for Desert Research, which tries to bring technologies to the drylands, and so we'll be working with that. On forestry, already I think we need to talk to them because about 95% of our trees succeed in the drylands and about 10% of theirs do. So I think there is technology transfer that can take place, but we can learn a lot from them too. I mean, they're running forward, and I think that it's going to be a exchange more than just assistance in that respect.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. We have one over here, another one there. Thank you.
Just to brainstorm here.
Please take the microphone.
Just brainstorming a little bit. Does anyone ever look at the possibilities of importing water from water-rich countries, and what are the economies involved in that, or would it even make a difference as to the required demand?
So I have 2 anecdotes to share on that issue. Okay, sure.
The natural gas deposits that have been discovered are not just under the Mediterranean, but some have been found under land. And obviously we all have, I'm Michelle Liban-Levine with Congregation Bethel of Montgomery County, and I'm the chair of their environmental committee, Green Tikkun. So I'm wondering whether there are innovations being developed to treat water that may be seriously impacted by hydraulic fracturing.
Okay. So with regard to the importation of water, for many years there were all kinds of ideas proposed, be they major peace pipes to come from Turkey, which is sort of the water superpower in our region, and bring them down, or people spoke about what they called Medusa bags, giant plastic bags that would float down the Mediterranean or whatever. And the first person I talked about when he was the water commissioner was Dan Zaslavsky, and he used to say, when we finally realize Isaiah's vision and the lion lies down with the lamb, I want to be the lion. And so there's no way that we are going to put our trust in, with all due respect to Turkey, such a critical resource, put that in the hand of a country, an Islamic country. And I think history has kind of borne them out in terms of that wisdom of that decision. Nonetheless, about 5 years ago, the foreign ministry was extreme, before we got into trouble with Turkey, was very, very pushy about, we've such an imbalance of trade, we've got to give them, as they signed some kind of agreement, that they were going to explore the ideas. And I could understand that you would want to, help them out, but let's, subsidize Turkish rugs, which are fantastic. But when you can desalinize water for 54 cents, or bring it in tankers, which have all kinds of implications in terms of getting the oil off. They want to take old oil tankers and bring it down for a much higher price. It just doesn't make sense anymore. And I don't think anybody really considers it seriously. The sea has solved that problem if we can get over the energy hurdle. With regard to there was two questions. Was it, or was it just the natural gas?
Purified water that's damaged by hydraulic.
Well, the issue of fracking is come to Israel with a vengeance. We have a huge amount of shale water. If anybody's been to the Beit Jubrin caves in that area out there, there's a whole, apparently copious amounts of natural gas that are just waiting for Israeli development. I was extremely delighted to be on the committee of the Jewish National Fund, which officially came out strenuously opposing present exploration of that, because we're just not ready in terms of it's in the mountain aquifer, which is a critical water resource, and we maybe feel more comfortable 5-10 years down the line when we have maybe better technologies or sure ways of doing it. The local residents are extremely opposed. They have an idea of turning their region into a Provence and a wine-growing region. They don't want to become, I don't know where the big, Houston, Texas, a big oil refining an area. With regard to the marine deposits, and here again, environmentalists have a hard time admitting such good news of this, and natural gas is good news. It's not a panacea. I mean, the greenhouse gas carbon footprint is about maybe 50% of coal. That's still, if you can't use it, it's not candy. It has a price. The thing is that there are sort of two aspects which are of concern environmentally. The one is the notion of the development of it. And the U.S. government was very, very generous and helpful in sending over a delegation of 4 experts who work largely, I think, in the Gulf of Mexico, but really experts on this issue of how do you regulate the natural gas and oil exploration with as minimal environmental impact as possible. And they brought them to Israel for about a week, and they went around and they looked and they talked to everybody and they consulted. And then the Israeli government uncharacteristically said, let's open it to the public. And at Bar Ilan University, there was a whole day where these experts just got to talk and say what they thought. And it was very, very interesting. But in between the niceties of diplomatic, these were Israeli American officials, basically what they said to Israel was, are you guys on drugs? I mean, what are you thinking about developing such amazing amounts of gas with no regulatory infrastructure? Most of the gas fields are in Israel's economic zone, not in the territorial waters, which means that many of our environmental laws are not enforced there, and that maybe you don't want to run into us. The gas isn't going anywhere, but Noble Energy has certain abilities to make things move quickly, and they have begun drilling oil and gas off the coast of Ashdod. And when Leviathan gets going, it's going to be a massive undertaking. So I'm very happy that we have, the other thing was how much do you want to export? And that's a whole other discussion, maybe less relevant to your question. It has to do with sort of, social issues. But there is a great concern that we're playing catch up and that we sort of put the horse before the cart in terms of, first they're trying to take the natural gas up, and then they'll try to play catch up and set up some sort of an inspection system. Wouldn't it have been smarter to wait 2 or 3 years? The price of natural gas would only have gone up.
Thanks very much.